Dear friends, first I want to state my gratitude for being invited to present our ideas at this conference. The global community is in a important crossroads at this point in time, and I wanted to introduce those kinds of issues. But the first thing I wanted to say, I knew it would have been difficult to follow President Klaus, right? But there were at least one surprise. So one surprise is that I agree with these three propositions, right? To reduce the competencies of the international development institutions. Number two, to keep the process of international development intergovernmental, right? And number three, to broaden the membership. If I can get through all my slides, you can find that a lot of these things are actually part of the slides that I have. I guess my difference with President Klaus is that he would quote Hayek, about uncertainty, and I would quote Keynes, right? They were friends. Actually, Keynes in the 30s found a job for Hayek in Cambridge, right? And they actually were looking at the same reality, but they were deriving a different kind of proposition from this reality, right? That Keynes thought that the private sector is very unstable, and a lot of the uncertainty comes from the instability of private sector behavior. If I can go through my slides, I can show you a graph about that. And what Keynes wanted to do was to say to reduce this kind of behavior, that the government would have, a state kind of agency would have some role in reducing this uncertainty. Let me start my presentation. What I'd really like to do is to present to you the SDGs. And number two, to try to explain, to try to say what would be the role of the international development institutions in this SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. Last September 25, right after the session when Pope Francis spoke to the UN General Assembly, the heads of the UN member states adopted a document called Transforming Our World, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which is now called actually Agenda 2030. So Agenda 21, which was agreed in '92, has now become Agenda 2030. And this replaces the Millennium Development Goals, MDGs, which used to shape development thinking in the early 2000s, right? And this is supposed to be a very ambitious document. If you look at the document, there are ringing phrases in the document. In fact, this is another attempt at an intergovernmental effort to achieve certain goals, right? And I'll put the goals soon. This list, unlike the MDGs, was negotiated so it was an intergovernmental outcome, right? So unlike the MDGs, which are designed by some expert in the Secretary General's Office of the UN, these were fiercely negotiated, and I can give you some examples of how they were negotiated, right? It is not true, in the spirit of dialogue, that parliaments were not involved. As an intergovernmental organization, I was assigned a seat beside the Interparliamentary Union, right? And the IPU held events, and they looked at the text, and they discussed it during the negotiating area. So the Interparliamentary Union, as a representative of parliaments, were actually involved. So there was a very big global community that were involved in this in making this agenda. And it's very small, right? Because now there are 17 goals. But if you look at the title, there are 169 commandments, right? That comes from the Economist. The Economist said, how can you fulfill 169 commandments? Because there are 17 goals, and they have been broken down into sub-goals. And in the end, there are 169 lines in this outcome. The point I guess the point that you have to understand about this is that because it was intergovernmentally determined, which is President Klaus actually said would be a very important feature of international agreement, the developing countries were able to put in the kinds of goals that they wanted to see. Just to say very quickly, in the case of Africa, the African continent the countries in the African continent came up with what is called an African Common Position. And the African Common Position about the future development strategy can be summarized in one word: industrialization. Africa is going to industrialize, right? They're not going to be worried about, they think that the permanent solution to poverty is industrialization, and it's one of the goals that have come up. Now, just to characterize very quickly how these goals are, right? Number one, the way these goals, the list of the goals treats the causes, not just the symptoms. So, for example, poverty can be seen as an outcome of lack of industrialization, lack of productivity. It addresses the long-term causes of poverty, not just act on quick fixes, because you can always get official development aid, right? And official development aid can put a person above the poverty line, but when the next balance of payments crisis happens, you put the family back into poverty. And we developing countries, now just like the Greeks and the Spanish and the Portuguese, are very used to balance of payments crisis, right? So the insecurities and the imperfections of the international system have now gone to bite the same countries that have been imposing these kinds of conditions on us. The third feature of this is that this list, instead of only objectives, because the MDGs were only about goals, it also includes the means of implementation, how to achieve the list. For example, if you look at SDG 6 to 9, these are how you want to achieve the goals of poverty, which is in the first line of this chart, right? Which is poverty, hunger, health, education, and gender. The developed countries, we developing countries, have always been very conscious. They like us to fight poverty, and they like the problem only to be our problem, right? We believe that we are entitled to have goals that we must industrialize and increase our people's productivity. The next feature of this set of goals is that it has universal responsibility. All countries are responsible. Even the US has to be responsible for the first goal, which is removing extreme poverty everywhere, right? And finally, it takes an integrated and holistic view of development. This is what this phrase sustainable development was all about. In 1992, when the global community came around to it, the formulation was that poverty is the biggest polluter, right? Because poor people would take forest resources and burn them and destroy the forest. This is the same thing. In a sense, if you have a holistic view, an integrated view, you have to worry not just about climate change. You have to make sure that climate change is solved while the developing countries industrialize and increase their income. I would just like to give an example of. So these are the goals that I talked about very quickly. I don't want to talk too long. Let me give you an example. The water goal, right? Which is 6. Universal, and in a sense, it talks about what is universal. So the goal is stated as ensure availability and sustainable management of water and sanitation for all, right? And then 6.1, which is one of the breakout goals, achieve universal and equitable access to safe and affordable drinking water for all. Think about what is required to do this, right? If you live in Switzerland, you probably don't need a lot of energy, right? Because you can take the water out of the mountains and use gravity to bring water for everybody, right? But you will need actually energy. You need investment in energy in order to provide clean water for all, right? So you have to invest in energy. And as a developing country, what kind of energy can we invest in? Well, most of the time it's cheaper to invest in a coal-fired plant, right? Now this will contradict in a very strong way the problem for climate change, but there is an existing legal commitment by developed countries, right? By developed countries, that the incremental cost of putting a renewable energy plant would be provided by the developed countries, right? In effect, all of these goals are political goals. They are political commitments. The first line of commitment has to be our own officials, our own elected officials, elected or non-elected. They are responsible to us for fulfilling these goals. And if they don't fulfill these goals, these are political commitments, they must be thrown out of office, right? But for us, the most important issue is the following. Even if they, and this is in a sense the Greek problem, right? even if they make these commitments to us, there are actual constraints in the international economy that prevent them, developing countries, I don't talk about the US, I don't talk about Europe, that prevent them, or I don't talk about non-indebted countries, creditor countries, that prevent them from fulfilling these commitments. Let me just say, the global partnership for development is actually very weak. And in effect, you have the chair actually said that there's 2 trillion. This is a very good estimate about how much more it would cost. The question is, where will it come from? Well, part of the content of the SDG is the following, that it has to be mostly internally driven. If you look at goal 8, right? Goal 8 is about economic growth. Developing countries must raise their own money, but in order to raise their own money, they must have access to economic growth. I think Jomo will talk about this in a longer way. But so financing for development, the Financing for Development Conference actually came out with no new money, no new mechanisms, and the continuation of decision-making by the North outside the UN. And in effect, we developing countries are living under a situation in which our money is being invested in international financial markets outside, in the developed countries. This graph shows the negative amount of the money that we are actually investing in the developed countries to buy our international reserves, to buy insurance against the sudden reversals of flows. And the other thing that is true is that relying only on the private sector internationally is actually very unstable. See, one graph here, the first graph that is peaking up and going down, are flows, right? And mostly these are private flows. The other graph that is quite stable is the fixed capital formation globally, right? You can see that these flows are actually going up and down, jumping up and down, without much impact on the amount of long-term investment that's actually occurring in these economies, which is what is important for development. And we are now facing what is called a balance of payments problem. We also know that these kinds of flows have always been episodic, the graph at the bottom. But we know that in May 2013, there was what was called a taper tantrum, a very big crisis, which very few people know among developing countries, when the flows from when the assets that rich investors had put into our government we started to reverse and go back to the United States. And this is actually happening now when the Federal Reserve is talking about raising its interest rates. In the meeting of the IMF and the World Bank last week in Lima, the IMF actually said that the US should try to avoid raising its interest rates. Let me go very quickly. I'm almost like in the last 4 or 5 slides that I have, right? Well, what do the developing countries need? They need more stable private international flows. And this actually requires better regulation of financial centers. This is one of the SDGs that have come out. It's 10.5. One of the things that I find very funny about the Greek situation is that during the borrowing spree of Greece, the spread of lending to Greece was almost zero, right? It's almost the same as the way in which private banks had lent to the Netherlands, or private banks had. So is this the market working or not, right? When the Greek crisis actually happened, all of a sudden the private bankers were very, very surprised that the Greeks retired at 55 and that they weren't paying their taxes. What, in a sense, what an institution of regulation that even President Klaus is looking for is the ability for private creditors to take the risk and be able to bear the cost of their mistakes. Instead of blaming the Greeks, they were always retiring at 55. Of course, now they're being forced to retire at, I don't know, I'm in Greece, so I better be careful about giving a number, right? But they're now being forced to retire earlier. But don't tell me the private sector didn't know that they were always retiring at 55 and the medical doctors weren't paying. So this is what better regulation of financial centers is, right? It will require a Dutch bank or a German bank to put up reserves against a Greek debt, right? Because the Greek people retired at 55, right? Unlike the Germans and all that stuff. So the second one is support for capital control measures to control the inflow and outflow of capital. I'm sure President Klaus will not agree with this, but for me, it's my interpretation of his second proposition of keeping the decisions on economics and development intergovernmental, keeping the ability to make these kinds of decisions at the local level as a sovereign decision. To stop using IMF funds to rescue private lenders. This is what they did in Europe in the beginning, right? They used the IMF funds to rescue Greece, Spain, Ireland, etc. And now all of a sudden the IMF is announcing we won't use our resources anymore to rescue the private lenders. And this is like a raid on a public resource, right? The next bullet point, President Klaus will not agree with, fulfill ODA commitments. And the main reason that this is true is that even though we're very serious about private financing to achieve sustainable development, we think that LDCs and poorer countries have very limited access to private markets. And therefore, there is a role on the part of the public sector in the developed countries to provide this framework. Finally, the last part of this is legal framework over sovereign debt restructuring. The US and the Europeans are very much against this, but you know that bankruptcy procedures appear, right, or exist in the domestic economies. They do not exist at the international level. And what happens is that there's a very ad hoc process, as you will see in Greece, as you saw in Portugal and Ireland with respect to this debt crisis. I'm going to finish soon. This one is President Klaus's bullet point, voice and participation of developing countries in these international development institutions. The other one is another way that we developing countries can respond to the problem. We could build our own alternative development financing vehicles, like the AIIB and the new development bank that was set up by the BRICS. The next bullet point is a very, very serious problem. It is the elimination of agricultural subsidies, right? Which is, the developed countries worry about our poor, but our most competitive sector is our agriculture, right? If they continue to subsidize their agriculture, how can we ever use that as an important platform for our development? And finally, to restore space for industrial development policies, which is SDG 9. Again, this is one of the important propositions from President Klaus. And maybe that's the last. So I want to thank you. I hope you have understood the proposal. I forgot one thing. In the water goal, the second goal was about making sure that women and children get access to clean water, plus countries in vulnerable situations. These SDGs were negotiated fiercely and bitterly. The phrase countries in vulnerable situations was about Palestine, right? And the U.S. and the Europeans, with the other countries, with the Israel there standing very quietly, fiercely fought against protecting the water rights of Palestinians. So these sets of goals actually have a lot of content that I urge you to study. And these are our agreements among the community of nations at the UN. Thank you very much.
Thank you.